Hello everybody, my name is HIATUS, and today I'll be doing a frequently requested spec spotlight for Mythic Plus, the Fury Warrior. This will be my last spec spotlight video of patch 8.2.5. After this, I'm going to shut the series down for about a month or so while the new patch hits, because I don't want to be creating this content that's going to be obsolete immediately after it comes out. So this is the last one, and then we'll resume with all of the other specs that have not yet been done in patch 8.3. Once I get through all or most of the specs that I haven't been done, I may start coming back to the ones that I did earlier in patch 8.2.5 as well, and update the information in them. Anyways, let's get started with the Fury Warrior. Alright, so let's start off by talking about the pros and cons of the Fury Warrior. The big reason to bring a Fury Warrior is just damage. Damage from 1 to 5 targets is fantastic for a Fury Warrior. Competitive. On single target, they're competitive with pretty much everybody in Mythic Plus. You know, maybe like if you have a Moonkin, the Moonkin might win over them, or if they're less geared or skilled than one of the other classes, but given equal gear and skill as any of the other classes, they should be owning on single target. On 5 targets as well, on 3 targets, those are all good numbers for Fury Warrior. Anywhere in that range, they're going to do good damage, and they're going to do good damage over a long period of time. So over like a 4-minute chain pull where they're staying in combat the whole time, Fury Warrior does not care about that. Whereas specs like Outlaw Rogue, you know, they have Blade Flurries that they run out of, and then they're low on resources. Fury doesn't have that same problem. They're just happy for the pull to go on forever. So very, very good damage overall is the main reason to bring a Fury Warrior. They are, however, also naturally tanky. They have, you know, passive damage reduction a lot of the time, and they do a tremendous amount of self-healing. Not necessarily as much as like a Demon Hunter on both of those fronts, but maybe second only to Demon Hunter in terms of being a DPS that doesn't require too much attention from the healer, and that's really, really good in high keys. It's not something you'll notice too much in the lower keys, but in the higher keys, you'll just notice the healer spending like twice as many globals on, you know, a paladin or whatever than a warrior in the DPS slot. The main drawback of the Fury Warrior is that they are target capped. What that means is that when you add more than 5 targets to a pull, Fury Warrior stops doing much extra damage to the 6th target does not take much extra damage from the Fury Warrior. That's because of the way that their Whirlwind ability works. So while a Fury Warrior is AoEing, they hit their Whirlwind button every 3 globals, and it causes their next 2 attacks to cleave onto 5 targets. 5 total targets. So their main target and 4 additional targets. And the 4 additional targets take 50% of the damage that the main target took. So that's a very high amount of extra damage to be done up to that 5th target. But once the 6th target enters the scene, that 6th target is not going to receive any damage. They're only going to take damage from like the Whirlwind itself and a few specific abilities they have, like Dragon's Roar or Blade Storm that they can talent into that will hit any number of targets. But beyond those, they're not going to be doing damage to more than 5 targets. So depending on the dungeon, depending on the situation, you know, it's not like they do less damage than other classes necessarily at 6 or 7 targets, because they're still doing fantastic damage to 5 of those 7 targets. But as you start going above those numbers, it starts to be really bad for Fury compared to other specs. And that's, you know, big pulls in places like Tol Dagor, where you're pulling maybe 10 or 15 mobs as your first pull of the dungeon. That's where Fury really starts to struggle compared to the other specs. Okay, so let's talk about the abilities of the Fury Warrior. Rallying Cry is a group-wide defensive that they can fire off that increases the maximum health of the whole group. This is actually pretty useful in high keys, in, you know, tyrannical boss encounters mainly is the place where this sees its best use, as helping the group get through things like Kragmaw's Tantrum, Overseer Korgus's, like if there's an explosive burst that might kill somebody, or just anytime there's just generally high damage across the group. The Fury Warrior can basically use this to try and save either one person or to just provide a little bit of a extra health padding to the whole group. And it combines nicely with, you know, damage reduction cooldowns that anybody else might bring, or effects like Darkness or whatever to help just stack up an extra little bit of effective health that then multiplies with whatever else anybody else in the group is doing. So a very powerful thing on a fairly short cooldown here as well at 2 minutes. So a nice thing that is brought by the Fury Warrior, and really the biggest piece of kind of utility that they have beyond, you know, crowd control effects. As far as crowd control effects go, they do have Intimidating Shout, which is an AoE fear. It's not a stun. It gets broken on damage pretty quickly, although not immediately. So the mobs will sometimes survive a little bit of damage, which can actually be a bit of a pain. Sometimes you'll use this thing and something will run away and not get broken out depending on, you know, what classes you have in your group, and if it doesn't have dots on it, and, you know, then you try and break it out with a low damage ability and it doesn't actually break out and it keeps running away. So that sometimes can happen. Usually though, the Intimidating Shout is just used when all the mobs are grouped up, being AoE'd, and you just use this to stop, some random cast, the Bulwark of Juju and Ataldazar, for instance. You just fire off Intimidating Shout to stop one or two of those, and immediately have the CC go away. So a useful thing, though, that is brought by the Fury Warrior. As far as stuns go, Fury Warrior lost Shockwave coming out of Legion, but they can still talent into Stormbolt, and generally do in high Mythic Plus settings. In lower keys, your Fury Warrior might just be playing double charge instead, like the thing that lets them charge twice on this talent row. But in a higher key setting, they're very likely to have Stormbolt, and that's a very useful way for them to have a actual stun and a piece of interaction with the enemies, because otherwise they're pretty low on those types of effects. If you need all the enemies to be slowed, Fury Warriors can contribute here with Piercing Howl. They can AoE slow. They need to choose to do this instead of doing damage, so it's not like a passive slow like Assassination Rogue's Crippling Poison is. But if they need to do this, it's a powerful slow that's spammable by the Fury Warrior. It's not just like a one-time only thing. And they do also have a rotational slow, usually talented in the form of Dragon Roar. DPS Warriors are known for executes, and Fury Warrior does have an execute. They usually will not talent into the thing that lets them execute things from 35% health or below, so usually they're executing enemies at 20% health or below. But one useful thing in an AoE setting is that if there's one enemy that is executable, they can execute off of that one with the Whirlwind buff active, and then do that increased damage to everything. Fury Warrior execute isn't like massive in the way that it was back in Legion, or even in the way that Arms is right now. So execute is less of a big deal for Fury Warrior than it has been in the past, or than it is for Arms, but it's still a good thing to note. And in particular, skilled Fury Warriors will be executing off of whichever targets in the pack are low on health, so that they can get that increased damage to the whole rotation. Warriors can taunt, although Fury does not have a immunity that they can hit after they hit their taunt to get a couple of seconds of breathing room. They do, however, have a powerful defensive in the form of Enraged Regeneration. So this doesn't stop them from taking the damage, but it reduces the damage that's incoming, and it turns their Bloodthirst into a massive self-heal. Played correctly, they can get 3 Bloodthirsts into their Enraged Regeneration, and that'll heal them for their whole health bar while this thing is active. So a very strong defensive that is especially useful because it lets them self-heal so much. It's not a great one to combine with Taunt because it doesn't come with parrying or anything, although in a pinch it can be done, and they can usually survive some hits from bosses with Taunt and Enraged Regeneration. But this is mostly useful for you have some dot on you or whatever, or just high group-wide damage, and the Fury Warrior can press this button and basically no longer require healing, even through heavy incoming raid-wide damage, and that's really, really big in Mythic Plus. Getting onto a few more niche things now, they can immune fears on themselves. This is most useful in Ataldazar and King's Rest, where there are some bosses that have fears. In Ataldazar, you can just line of sight Razan as well, but Fury Warriors can stay out for every time their fear immune is up and just fire that off instead. And then last boss of King's Rest also comes with a fear, so that is a nice place to have access to a way to immune that. You also don't need to worry about Battle Shout scrolls when you have a warrior in your group, because they bring the real Battle Shout, which is slightly better, but also notably just means that you don't have to use any consumables to get that attack power increase. This is only a benefit from the first warrior in the group, right? So if you're playing with multiple warriors, the second and further warriors don't bring this added benefit, but it's still a useful thing that the first warrior does bring. And they do have a passive damage reduction on themselves that is up most of the time, not always. But Warpaint is a talent they can take that gives them a 10% damage reduction while they are enraged. And that is most of the time, much of the time at least. So that makes them fairly tanky. The combination of Bloodthirst just healing them whenever they use it, some Azurite stuff that we'll talk about later, their powerful defensive that comes with a lot of self-healing, and the fact that they're just a plate-wearing, naturally damage-reducing class is really, really great. So all those things put together mean that a Fury Warrior is one of the last specs that needs to start worrying about getting one-shot by boss abilities. And that, it's up there with Havoc Demon Hunter in that category, basically. A few things that aren't on this page as well. Heroic Leap and Charge are their mobility options. There are also some boss abilities that can be cheesed with Heroic Leap or Charge. I mean, cheesed, they can be counterplayed, right, with Heroic Leap or Charge. You can use it to, dodge Upheaval on the Sand Queen in Toldagor. You can use it to get over to bridges and Freehold without pulling enemies that are near there, although that usually is only useful if the rest of the group can also skip all the enemies that are in the way there too. And then there are a bunch of things that you can just charge to get out of the way of danger, but you do have to have an offensive target to charge. It's not like Prot Warrior's Charge, which can also be used on friendlies. And every time a Fury Warrior lands a killing blow, they get a Victory Rush proc, which lets them then hit their Victory Rush button, which comes with a sizable self-heal. This is not reliable because they actually need to get that killing blow, and there's 5 or 4 other people in the group who are likely to get the killing blow as well. But if they do manage to get that killing blow, especially with something like Execute, sometimes that can line up fairly easily. Then they'll have this charge of Victory Rush that they can use to try and sustain. So if there's, in places like Toldagor first boss again, where there's those 5 ads that spawn all the time and keep dying all the time, it's pretty likely Fury Warriors will get some charges of Victory Rush that they can use to heal themselves, coincidentally through the heavy AoE damage on that fight, so it works out nicely. Okay, let's have a quick talk about the essences that Fury Warrior tends to run. Blood of the Enemy synergizes very nicely with the Fury toolkit, as it is on the same cooldown as Recklessness, so every single Recklessness, you'll have Blood of the Enemy at 1.5 minutes, and Blood of the Enemy is just a great essence for both single target and AoE for Fury Warrior. If they want to go full single target, they can go away from this towards something like Condensed Life Force or whatever, but that is generally something you'll only do if you are zoning out of a dungeon at the end of a dungeon, so the places this is usually done. Historically, that's been done in a couple places, but nowadays that's only really the meta in Toldagor, where you'll leave the group towards the end of the 3rd boss, and then as the boss dies, you'll run out of your timer and teleport back to back out of the dungeon, and then you can swap essences and get reinvited to the group and zone back in and kill the last boss with more single target. That's a strategy that people are doing these days. And then in the Motherlode, people are just hearthing or leaving the group towards the end of the 2nd boss, and then they're setting their Hearthstone to the Hosen Throne for the Horde, or just the little Dark Iron drill site outside of the Alliance entrance to the Motherlode, and then zoning back in again with a single target damage kit for the last 2 bosses, because you've already killed most of the trash at that time in the dungeon. So those are cases where you would use something other than Blood of the Enemy, is after switching outside of the dungeon, but inside a dungeon, Blood of the Enemy tends to be the gold standard, and honestly, if you keep it for those cases as well, unless you're pushing 25s or whatever, you're going to be fine with Blood of the Enemy in all cases. If you don't want to farm Blood of the Enemy, you can use something like Essence of the Focusing Iris. Essence of the Focusing Iris has some particular problems for Fury Warrior, where it's not like other specs where there's some downtime that you can fill in your AoE rotation profitably with Essence of the Focusing Iris. Fury Warrior basically always has buttons that they can be pressing in AoE, and so Focusing Iris, the opportunity cost of it is a lot higher than it is for specs like Outlaw that can just use it when they run out of Blade Flurries, or specs like Assassination that can maybe use it if they're low on energy at a certain point, or Havoc Demon Hunter, which gets a bunch of haste that synergizes with Essence of the Focusing Iris. Fury Warrior, one of the weaker specs to play Focusing Iris on relative to Blood of the Enemy. Blood of the Enemy quite a lot better. Generally, the minors for Fury are the same as you'll see on most other specs. Stuff like Conflict and Strife and Purification Protocol are just good ones, good cookie cutter ones. A little bit annoying to get to rank 3 right now, so if you don't have those, you may end up wanting to run something else in either of these slots, or if you want to run a little bit more single targety, then something like Essence of the Focusing Iris can also come in for just some raw stats, but really you can't go wrong with Conflict and Strife and Purification Protocol and M+. They're just good. They do a very simple thing that works very effectively in all situations. The Fury Warrior build is built around Cold Steel Hot Blood. This is an Azurite trait that you'll want 3 of. It's your best in slot Azurite trait for single target, but it is even better as you start cleaving. The way that this works is that every time you crit a Bloodthirst, you'll apply a dot to the target, and that dot also heals you. It leeches damage back to you. And that is it's a very high damage dot that is fully effective in cleave situations, right? So normally when you hit Whirlwind, you cleave for 50% damage onto 4 targets, but if you crit your cleaved Bloodthirsts, then they will apply a full damage Gushing Wound onto that target, and that is really, really, really valuable. So stacking this trait means that you'll be really increasing your damage, especially in AoE relative to single target, and it's just a fantastic thing to do. Synergizes nicely with Blood of the Enemy and Recklessness, because those are both crit steroids as well, so an Azurite trait that cares about critting, that works nicely with essences and class cooldowns that increase your crit. Beyond that, the main traits you'll see are ones that enhance the Rampage ability. So there's one that will make it so that your Rampage sometimes procs Recklessness, your big cooldown, for a couple seconds, and that's pretty cool. And there's one that makes your Rampage give you some Rage for each hit. These are both just little quality of life things that make Rampage a little better and increase the damage of Rampage, and Rampage is like your highest damage button already, so works out nicely. Getting both of these is ideal. If you can only get one, Unbridled Fury is better than Simmering Rage to get. And then the last Azurite trait that you can get, that 6th slot, can be pretty much anything. Swirling Sands, any kind of Swirling Sands is nice because it comes on a piece that then has overwhelming power. Getting overwhelming powers is, of course, very good for Fury. But really just anything in that last slot is fine. Do be careful if you get the one that enhances your auto attacks, Reckless Flurry. That one will desync your recklessness from your Blood of the Enemy and stuff, so that has a little bit of anti-synergy there. You may end up not wanting to actually run that thing in Mythic Plus, especially because it doesn't scale up to more than one target, even though it's a pretty good damage trait on single target. The best trinkets from Mythic Plus for Fury Warrior tend to be the Vial of Animated Blood. That one synergizes perfectly with Blood of the Enemy and Recklessness because it shares the same cooldown, or the Gore-Stained Butcher's Block, which is just good strength stats trinket. If you don't wish to use trinkets from Mythic Plus and you want to instead use the raid trinkets, a combo like Ashvane's Razor Coral and Dribbling Ink Pod works nicely. Just make sure that you're on long tyrannical boss fights. Try and line up the Coral with a Blood of the Enemy and a Recklessness, and the Dribbling Ink Pod Explosion at 30%. That's a really good way to make Ink Pod do massive damage in a high tyrannical setting. In a lower setting, it's often not worth trying to make that work if the boss fight is only 40 seconds anyway or whatever. All right, let's talk about the group comps that work nicely with Fury. Fury is a spec that really doesn't have big ways to interact with a pack. Luckily, most of the specs in the metagame right now, part of the reason that they're in the metagame is that they have a bunch of ways to interact with a pack, but making sure that you are bringing specs like Windwalker Monk, Brewmaster Monk, Outlaw Rogue, Havoc Demon Hunter, these specs that have just a bunch of ways to stop mobs from doing things is a very valuable thing to do. Monk in particular is really nice because that also brings the Chaos or the Mystic Touch physical damage increase, and all of a warrior's damage basically is physical, so that synergizes really nicely there. You're going to do that's a really good combination to bring to a group where everybody else is physical damage as well. You know, you've got the Battle Shout from the warrior, the Mystic Touch from the monk, and then you bring like some rogues or whatever that also do physical damage, and you've got everybody's increasing everybody's damage, and it's really nice that way. So that Fury Warrior slots really nicely into this kind of all physical comp. It's not bad to bring a Prot Warrior with the Fury Warrior, although you are, losing out on a little bit of value here on the Battle Shout now. So you often won't see more than one warrior in a group. So part of the reason that Monk works nicely with Fury Warrior is that Monk can be your tank. They can be a Brewmaster. Next season, we'll have to see what the tanking metagame ends up looking like, because the Brewmasters might be a little bit less popular next season than they are right now. But if they continue to be good, then that'll continue to be a good tank to pair with your Fury Warrior. The main tensions for your Fury Warrior is really just if you're pulling big. So this is something that is kind of difficult to do in patch 8.2.5 because of Azhara's emissaries throughout a dungeon. You can't really pull massive pulls that include Tide's emissaries because you aren't able to stop everything from killing your tank or random members of your group. So with Azhara's emissaries going away, we may start to see pull sizing increase by 2 or 3 mobs per pull. If that happens, Fury is not going to be happy, right? Fury is much happier at 5 targets than they are at 8 or 10. And even if they can be competitive in the 8 target range, if we start to have these big AoE pulls be a big part of dungeons, 9 targets, 13 targets, 14 targets as your first pull of the dungeon, for instance, Fury is not really contributing very much to those pulls compared to specs like Havoc or Outlaw or just, Windwalker, any kind of spec like that, Ret Pally even. Doing big damage in those AoE settings. So that's something that is the biggest worry about Fury Warrior going into patch 8.3 for me. If I was maining Fury Warrior right now, I would be most scared about that happening. Luckily, in that setting, Arms might end up being something that you can play, so you might still be able to play your Warrior very effectively in high keys next season, maybe. Arms has had some problems this expansion, but it might step in to be effective there. And even if that's a weakness of Fury, right? Specs are allowed to have some weaknesses in Mythic Plus and still be good for the rest of it. Balanced Druid, for instance, is a notable example of a spec that has the same weakness here as Fury of really big pulls, and that is a spec that has been popular in Mythic Plus, even in routes that have included big pulls. So it's not the end of the world if pull sizing ends up going up, but that would be a drawback for Fury Warriors next season. Thanks everybody for watching. I hope you enjoyed this look at the Fury Warrior. If you're interested in learning more, I'm going to put some links in the description to Anda, the top Fury Warrior in the world right now for Mythic Plus, who does stream and have a YouTube channel, and also has just done a Raider.io interview spotlight article that you can read on Raider.io. I'll put the link in the description for that as well. A very good look at the state of the class from his perspective. A very valuable perspective to have, of course, because he's so good at it. So if this is something that at all interests you, I'd absolutely recommend checking that out in the description below. Outside of that, check out my stream, twitch.tv/Ratnos, and remember to like and subscribe. Thanks everybody for watching. I'll see you in the next one.